Yeah, there's more to the Cubs story. You know, Gary used to live in Chicago and he moved to Charlotte, and I told him if the Cubs win after you moved to Charlotte, the curse was you, not the goat, and so clearly the curse was him. So. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Gary. So my presentation this morning builds on some of the points that Merrill raised. However, I'm going to take a slightly different approach as we cover some creative solutions that engineers may utilize to resolve problematic channel assignments for stations in the post-auction repack. As many of you know, channel assignment process used by the FCC for the post-auction channel assignments created several problematic channel assignments for stations, and solving these problems in many cases is a complex and complicated task and requires the use of many different tools in the RF engineer's toolbox. However, with proper application of those tools and some creative approaches, many of these problematic assignments can be resolved. So just as a recap, we know about 987 stations in the United States will be changing channels over the next few years, 30 auction-winning stations moving to VHF, and about 957 stations moving to their in-core channels, not band changing, but moving to other channels within the band to make room for those stations that are in channels 38 to 51 to move down into the core spectrum. This process utilized by the Commission was largely driven by the TV study core application that many of us use, with various constraints placed on it and weights added for various outcomes for various combinations of channel assignments. However, in departure from previous processes and procedures at the Commission, this was not a rulemaking procedure, so broadcasters did not have an opportunity to review the plan prior to its adoption or to make comments or try to optimize the plan. As a consequence of the repacking, more stations into less spectrum, there's obviously some trade-offs, and here are a few. There are a number of new Channel 14 assignments in the plan, which I'll detail more in a moment and sort of be the prime focus of my presentation today. In addition, there are more adjacent channel assignments, as well as generally tighter co-channel spacing and tighter adjacent channel spacing pretty much all around for all stations in the new core spectrum. And with the move to new channels, new concerns arise about protecting quiet zones that have existed for a long time, such as Table Mountain in Colorado and the West Virginia quiet zone, as well as numerous other RF-sensitive sites that broadcasters have to protect. All of that is to say that much tighter packing is a result, and the use of less desirable channels is more prevalent now due to the repacking. As noted by Merrill in his presentation, Channel 14 assignments are particularly problematic in the post-auction repack. There are approximately 33 new Channel 14 assignments made in the post-auction repacking process, and there are approximately 15 stations currently operating on Channel 14 that will remain on their existing channels. So in total, in the post-repacking environment, we could potentially have a total of 48 Channel 14 assignments in operation throughout the United States. So what is the problem with Channel 14, and why do so many broadcasters avoid it like the plague? The biggest problem with Channel 14, as Merrill pointed out, is that it is immediately adjacent to land mobile operations in the 450 to 470 megahertz band. Channel 14 occupies the spectrum from 470 to 476, and there is no guard band between the land mobile operations and the TV operations on Channel 14. Also, not to be forgotten, is the lower UHF channels 14 to 20 are shared on a shared basis with what we've referred to them as the T-band channels with land mobile operations in many of the large urban areas. And these land mobile operations on the T-band channels are comprised of a lot of public safety operations, so they're not just your taxi service. This slide actually came from Shure, and you may see this again in just a moment, but I added a few little things to this to show that there is really no guard band between Channel 14 and the land mobile operations. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. And also the T-band channels that we share 14 to 20 in the large urban areas. Those all have to be protected. And in fact, the Commission has rules about guard band for T-band channels. So in Washington, D.C., we can't use the adjacent channels channels to T-band because we're providing a guard band for the land mobile operations that are on those T-band channels. Channel 14 does not have that same requirement, so it doesn't meet the Commission's own rules with respect to protection of the land mobile operations. So let me walk through an example and give you sort of some ideas about the way that we've been thinking about this. So a real example of a problematic channel assignment is WETA right here in Washington, D.C., and I'll use this as an example. WETA's current facility is on channel 27. It's located on a combined shared antenna system with two other stations, WHUT and WPXW. And that tower facility, which we locally all refer to as the Chesapeake Street site, is also shared with 5 FM stations and 2 high-band VHF stations, channel 7 and channel 9. So it's a relatively congested site. As you might imagine, trying to put a channel 14 facility on a combined antenna system with all of those other carriers would be probably an IM nightmare to think about it, just generally. But WETA's new assignment in the Post-Repack, they got their confidential letter. It was channel 14 and a dipole adjusted ERP of 53.8 kilowatts, and they were assigned to transition phase 4. So as soon as WETA received their confidential letter, we started sort of analyzing what the potential problems would be related to Channel 14 operations in the Washington, D.C. area. And our initial cut at the study, we determined that, as you might imagine, there is just a ton of land mobile operations in the Washington, D.C. area in this band. Many of the users in this band are public safety entities as well as local commercial and government operations, including the Trump International Hotel, strangely enough. Our initial study revealed that approximately 2,136 licensees were within a 100-kilometer interference distance and over 10,964 frequencies and locations for those licensees. And this is only considering 464 to 470 megahertz, so the 6 megahertz right below the Channel 14 assignment. So that was the first cut, and then we decided, well, let's take another look and actually look at predicted interference. So we ran another study based on predicted field strength and the required desired undesired ratios for protection of land mobile licensees, and determined that of that pool, over 1,200 licensees would be potentially impacted by interference from the WETA Channel 14 operation, and over 5,800 frequencies and locations would also be potentially impacted. Given the required protection and mitigation that Merrill just outlined in his presentation, it was very clear to us that this would be a very costly facility to implement, particularly with regard to mitigation of interference to land mobile facilities. And given the short 39-month repacking process, it would be difficult to resolve all of those potential interference issues prior to the end of the 39-month process and the closeout of the Broadcaster Reimbursement Fund. So potentially WETA could be on the hook to fund the costs of resolving this interference beyond the 39-month repacking process. So here's a map of potentially impaired land mobile facilities with various interference mechanisms. As Merrill pointed out, there's really sort of two main interference considerations with respect to land mobile. One is the out-of-band interference from the Channel 14 transmitter that essentially becomes co-channel noise to the land mobile operators. And the second mechanism is essentially just brute force overload. That is a very high undesired signal from Channel 14 overloading the tuner or receiver in the land mobile radio. So this map shows green dots are basically the out-of-band emission impairments. The red dots are those that would have overload problems, and then the blue dots are a combination of both mechanisms. So, given the issues with Channel 14, it was very clear to us that we'd like to find another channel, please. Channel 14 just did not seem to be a workable assignment in the Washington, D.C. area for a variety of reasons. So given that it looked, sort of difficult to do that, we looked at many different possible solutions to the WETA Channel 14 assignment. So I'll walk through these scenarios and give you some key points on them. I don't have time to really cover all of them in my presentation today, but just to sort of give you some high points. And as my business partner Gary Sgrignoli says, there is no free lunch here. You can't get something for nothing, so there are always trade-offs and compromises associated with each one of these potential solutions, and I'll walk through what some of those are. So the first thing that we took a look at, somebody had suggested to us that Channel 20 might be a potential solution, and moving the assignment from 14 to 20 would possibly work. So we did a pretty in-depth study of that. The thing about Channel 20 is, of course, is that Channel 20 is used as Land Mobile in Philadelphia, so it's a T-band channel, and we would be short-spaced with Philadelphia by about 50 kilometers. The required spacing is 250 kilometers, and the existing WETA site is short. It's only 199 kilometers, so it's about 51 kilometers short. However, in the intervening years, Channel 20 actually used to be an analog station in Washington, as many of you that live here know. In the intervening years after the analog shutdown, the FCC Wireless Bureau actually granted waivers to Land Mobile operators to operate outside the Philadelphia protection zone. So they actually located Land Mobile operations much closer to Washington, D.C. than they were required to, because the Channel 20 analog had gone away. So in the intervening years, we created a problem where now we have Land Mobile operations that are actually much closer to Washington than they're supposed to be. So even though there's probably fewer of those stations, it would still require Land Mobile mitigation to solve the Land Mobile problems. And unfortunately, many of these waiver requests were granted to police and fire departments in many cities, so it was a public safety issue more than just commercial operators. Another issue that we determined with Channel 20 is that actually Channel 20 was assigned to a station in Harrisonburg, Virginia. So we would be mutually exclusive with that station. We'd have to find another channel for that station. When broached the subject of potentially doing a channel swap, I think the answer to would you take Channel 14 was not only no, but hell no. So that was sort of a non-starter. And the other problem with Channel 20 in the Washington area was that Maryland Public Television actually had two stations that had been assigned on the adjacent Channel 21. So we would have an adjacent Channel 20, Channel 21 problem to resolve. So all of that is to say that the Channel 20, although it looked on the, sort of at the initial cut at this as a potentially promising station or a channel assignment, it turns out that there were just a lot of problems to solve with Channel 20. This map illustrates the spacing requirement that I noted a moment ago with regard to the Philadelphia Land Mobile operations, as well as some field strength numbers for those. As you can see here, obviously, even without the Land Mobile waivers that the Wireless Bureau had issued for Land Mobile operations outside the protected T-band channel operational area, there would have probably likely been interference issues with Land Mobile in the Philadelphia area. And with the addition of those stations even closer to Washington, it just made sort of that a non-starter. So I'm going to walk through a second scenario that we started looking at, which actually was a little more promising. The second scenario we looked at, we studied and studied this as a rather unique approach. I call this creating a channel where none exists now. And this idea came from the fact that Maryland Public Television has two stations in their network that currently operate on a co-channel basis with each other. WFPT in Frederick and WCPB in Salisbury both currently operate on Channel 28. And in the repack, they were both moving to Channel 21. So we have two stations that have a common licensee that are moving to Channel 21. These stations are geographically separated from each other, so there isn't a co-channel interference problem, and because they're both commonly owned by the same licensee, obviously they can sort of control that from an interference perspective. But the idea was to create a three-station DTS, or distributed transmission system, on Channel 21, and that would free up one of the Maryland Public Television stations, Channel 31 assignment at Annapolis, to be used at the Washington site. So that's sort of conceptually the idea. We would take WMPT, which is in the Annapolis facility, that it was moving from 42 to 31, move it to 21 instead, create a 3-station DTS on 21, and then reuse the 31 assignment at Washington, D.C. That's conceptually how this would work. And it would involve, obviously, new assignments for station in Maryland at WMPT in Annapolis and also for WETA. So this is a map that sort of illustrates the existing Salisbury and Frederick stations. These are both stations that currently operate on 28. They were both moving to 21. And there's a little gap in the middle there, which is actually the Annapolis station that is currently on 42 and would be moving to 31. So just staring at this map for a while, the idea was, well, let's just make them all 321, and then we can take the Channel 31 assignment that was in Annapolis and move that to Washington, D.C. So that was the concept of the solution. So we did some more work on this, and the first thing that in an initial DTS design that sort of stood out almost immediately was the fact that if we took the Annapolis station and moved it to 21, it would create an adjacent channel problem with Maryland Public Television Station in Baltimore that was on the upper adjacent channel 22. So what to do? How do we solve that problem? Well, there's a significant overlap of those stations. Well, let's just add it to the DTS. So the idea was take 22, make it 21, so now we have a 4-station DTS facility, and that eliminates the adjacent channel problem with 21 in Annapolis and 22 in Baltimore. So the studies that we performed indicate that with some minor adjustments and tweaking, we could actually make that work. It would end up being a 4-station DTS that would require 4 of the Maryland public television stations moving to 21, and then WETA using the Channel 31 allotment. And I'm leaving out some details here because I'm just kind of talking about sort of concepts, but the one thing that would sort of be added to this is that we could potentially move the 21 station for Frederick and co-locate that at the WETA site just to sort of solve some interference and coverage problems. So that also was sort of on the table, is to move one of the stations and co-locate it. So we did an initial cut at a design just to really see if it's feasible to do this, not to really optimize the design, but just to sort of answer the question, is this technically a workable solution? So this is a map of the coverage of what we call scenario 1, with the Maryland public television stations all moving to channel 21. And the red dots that you see on the map are the inter-system interference or self-interference from the DTS that has to do with the timing and amplitude arrival of the signals at the various locations. And as I pointed out, this is not a final design, just more or less a conceptual design, but you can see that we could achieve coverage in a large portion of the Maryland public television coverage area with this approach. So we took a little deeper dive at it and said, well, let's just, not try to use existing patterns. If we just start from scratch, just use the existing sites and sort of tailor some azimuth and elevation patterns, what's kind of a good cut at a second cut at a design. So this is a map that shows the second version of a DTS design where we completely changed the antenna patterns and attempted to reduce the inter-system interference and optimize the coverage while minimizing the timing issues between the stations. I should note that this map was developed using an omnidirectional receive antenna. So as many of you know, in OET 69, as implemented, is we always use a receive antenna pattern to get some discrimination. This map is done without that discrimination. So this is, if you had an omni receive antenna, where would the interference points be? So that's kind of the point of this map, is that this is probably the best you could do without spending a lot of time on designing the system using an omnidirectional receive antenna. Obviously, if you optimize the thing for an omni receive antenna, then you go to a directional antenna. That really solves a lot of your problems because now you have some discrimination between the transmitters. So this is the same design with the actual FCC OET 69 receive antenna pattern considered at the receive site. So it eliminates most of the inter-system interference with the exception of a few places. So this was not a final design, but the idea was, is this even technically feasible, and would it be possible to construct such such a facility, and that was the result of that study. This map just illustrates the field strength within the Maryland viewing areas from the various transmitters for the DTS network on Channel 21. You'll note that generally we were able to provide higher field strength and coverage in large portions of the state with service in the 60 to 90 dBu range, and very large portions of the state, greater than 90 dBu field strength levels in many locations. So that is one of the advantages to that approach. But if you sort of weigh the pros and the cons of this approach, what do those really look like? So obviously from WETA's perspective, the pro was they ended up with not being on Channel 14. So they ended up with not having to mitigate all those Channel 14 land mobile issues. It would simplify the combiner system at the Chesapeake transmitter site by allowing Channel 31, 33, and 35 to be combined as opposed to the previous Channel 14, 33 and 35, and we had done some RF sweeps and some investigation of the existing antenna system and combining system at Chesapeake, and it was going to be very difficult to implement Channel 14 at that facility. It was going to require a lot of retuning and a significant amount of tower work, which meant the stations would be off of the facility for some number of weeks while that tuning and optimization work took place on the master UHF antenna. So that was also another problem with the Channel 14 assignment at the Chesapeake Street site. Another con is that it would require new antenna designs for the Maryland public stations. Many of the MPT stations were planning to reuse existing broadband antennas. In fact, the 3 stations that we were proposing to move to the DTS, all 3 of them had broadband panel antennas that they weren't planning to replace. So one of the cons is they would have required replacing those antennas with very likely highly customized directional antennas with specific elevation patterns to make the interference things work. So it would have required 3 new antennas that we weren't planning on buying for Maryland Public TV. This approach also requires DTS equipment and the timing of the network, so you'd have to really complete the full DTS network design, which we had not attempted to do, but just to prove feasibility. And the other thing that was of concern is that Maryland was moving off of their existing microwave interconnect and going to a Maryland State fiber backbone, which was all IP delivery out to the transmitter facility. So there were some questions about latency and network buffering issues that would have caused some deeper review of their existing STL plans and their migration to entirely IP delivery to the transmitter site. So we would have had to review that and determine if that was going to be problematic. Also, this was potentially costly to build. From a reimbursement perspective, it was unclear to us whether the commission would grant reimbursement to pay for the DTS solution that was a possibility here, and that would have required some decision making on the reimbursement side. So that was another potential con of that proposal. And finally, some service extensions on some of the MPT stations would likely have required waivers of some of the DTS rules because they would have been extending beyond their permitted contours. So with that sort of as a first idea, we refined the idea with a second approach, what I call scenario 2, which was another DTS design, but much less complex. So given the complexity in solution scenario 1, we looked at another possible solution. And this idea involved moving the WMPT transmitter from Annapolis to the DC tower site with WETA at that site. So they would operate from channel 31 at the DC site as opposed to the Annapolis site. And this proposal would have freed up channel 30 on the lower adjacent for use by WETA. However, when we dug through this a little deeper, it was clear to us that channel 30 would have been mutually exclusive with a Class A station in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia that was moving to channel 30, so then we would have had to find an alternative assignment for them, either channel 14 or channel 20, which also had adjacent channel issues with stations in Washington and Harrisonburg, and in case of Harrisonburg, co-channel issue, and adjacent channel issue with the Maryland Station 21 in Frederick. So that would have had to have been resolved, and some negotiation have taken place with the Class A station with regard to that approach. The other problem that it would have created is that if we move the Annapolis station to Washington, the Annapolis service would not have been as robust. So it would have required backfilling the Annapolis area with a Channel 31 DTS for Maryland Public Television. So they would have ended up with a two-station DTS between Washington and Annapolis. And of course, if we put the Channel 30 DTS in Annapolis, that creates an adjacent channel problem with the Channel 30 assignment for WETA. So WETA then has to have a DTS in Annapolis. So the idea of this scenario was, instead of one four-station DTS, you end up with two DTS networks, each of them with two stations, but you still have four transmitters at the end of the day. It's just in a different place. So what we're doing is we're kind of moving the bubble around, but not really solving the problem. So that solution, we sort of took a deep look at it, but it didn't seem to be what I would term viable at this point. And so we moved on to other possible scenarios. So the last scenario that I'll talk about, and I'm just going to mention this because I don't have a lot of details to provide you with this, but this was a channel swap scenario. And this did not involve using a DTS to create channels where you need them. But in this scenario 3 approach, what we did was move some channel assignments and adjust ERPs and antenna patterns to resolve the interference problems with adjacent and co-channel stations. So as shown here, the proposal 3 or scenario 3 is to move Channel 31 from Annapolis to DC, our original idea. But in Annapolis, we would then, instead of moving to 31, as had been the original assignment, we would move that to 21, which is the station, the Salisbury and Frederick stations that we're moving to 21. We'd actually move that assignment to Annapolis, and then those two stations would need to find new channels. So WFPT and WCPB in this case would be moved to different channels, and it turned out that WFPT could actually stay on 28 with some tweaks in their ERP to resolve adjacent channel interference problems. And WCPB could move to channel 16, which was actually a station assignment on the Eastern Shore for another station. But the problem with 16 then is we have a land mobile interference problem with Washington, D.C. But given the spacing, we can fix that with ERP and a tighter mask filter. So the channel 16 works at Salisbury. Is not a problem with the adjacent channels, particularly related to land mobile in the Washington market, and it also clears the channel 15 assignment, television station in Washington. Channel 28 for Frederick would stay on the existing channel, but tweak the ERP to make it work with the adjacents 27 and 29. The Maryland station in Baltimore then would stay moving to 22 as they had been assigned, but we would increase that power of that station to solve the adjacent channel interference problem with the Annapolis station, channel 21 at WMPT. So we raised that ERP to solve the adjacent channel between 21 and 22. And the fallout from that station raising power is then we have a Class A station that has that is moving and being repacked on channel 23. They have to raise their ERP to solve the adjacent channel problem from WMPB in Baltimore. So that is another scenario solution where we end up eliminating the channel 14 assignment, but we have 5, 6 stations that have to make modifications to their facilities in order to resolve all the interference problems. So that's a creative approach, I think. So just to give you sort of a summary of some of the creative solutions, obviously, many of us are familiar with TV study parameters that can be changed, cell sizes, terrain increments, those sort of things. But also looking for new, different channels that may work. It's very useful many times to look at the adjacents, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. But obviously, directional antenna pattern changes, looking at using the adjacents to existing stations in the same market, and to the extent that we have a lot of consolidated ownership, it is now possible that adjacent markets have common ownership. So interference agreements now are much easier to develop than they were in years past, because in many cases the adjacent market stations you have a problem with is owned by the same owner. The biggest bang for the buck in anybody's book is co-location. That really solves a lot of the interference problems. So if you can co-locate, particularly the adjacents, that's going to be a solution worth looking at. Obviously, distributed transmission systems, which I sort of demonstrated here briefly, is another another possible solution. I know there is another station that is proposing to do a DTS to solve some of its assignment problems. Common antenna patterns, both azimuth and elevation, will help resolve adjacent channel problems, and in antenna heights are another thing that we see a big difference in that create a lot of interference. And then, of course, interference agreements and multi-party channel swaps, as we demonstrated here. And then, last but not least, consider waivers if applicable. So those are the creative solutions for problematic channel assignments, and I'd be happy to answer questions.